Here I want to talk about national security states and the dirty wars. Beginning in the 1960s, a new type of military regime emerged in South America. And these were military governments that were quite different from military dictatorships of the past. So whereas in the past, the military dictatorship was usually revolved around one individual, such as Porfirio Diaz in Mexico or Jorge Ubico in Guatemala, the military dictatorships of the 60s, they institutionalized military rule. And they would perpetuate themselves in power. And so in most of these countries, it wasn't one specific dictator that ran the country, but it was the military as an institution. And usually they established a four-man executive junta with representatives from the armed forces, and there would be a rotation in the presidency every few years between the military leaders. And they were called national security states because of their dedication to promote domestic order above all other goals. And again, rather than seeing the threat as coming from outside the country, these military governments see the threat from within. So that they faced internal threats to their security. And a lot of these military governments and the officers who ran them, they got their training from the United States. And last week I talked about the School of the Americas, which was first in the Panama Canal Zone. A lot of these thousands of these military officers were trained at the School of the Americas. And the national security states, they opposed all opposition, and whether it was socialist or populist or liberals, but particularly they went after leftists. And I'll talk more about some of their repressive policies in the dirty wars here in a minute. But they all continued some of the economic policies they inherited, such as import substitution, industrialization. And one thing that was different, though, was they became much more friendly to foreign investment and to foreign business. And they invited foreigners to invest in these countries, and foreign corporations actually liked these military governments because they provided a good, stable atmosphere for foreign investment in these countries. And the middle class also supported these military governments because the middle class at first in the early 60s was quite sympathetic towards the Cuban Revolution, which inspired people throughout Latin America. But as the Cuban Revolution became more radical and started to become more communistic, that scared the middle class in Latin America. And so the middle class would support these military dictatorships in the name of fighting communism. And a lot of middle-class people as well gained government jobs because the government and the state was growing during these years, playing an even stronger role in the economy. And so the government employed a lot of people in the middle class. But in the end, these military governments, they would end up with a lot of debts because they took out a lot of foreign loans. And I'll talk about that next, in actually 2 weeks when we get to the 1980s. This new type of military dictatorship first emerged in South America, and specifically in the southern cone countries such as Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. Brazil's maybe not technically in the southern cone, but for the sake of discussion here, we'll include it. And all of these military dictatorships, they broke with Cuba, and they would target union leaders, peasant leaders, and leftists and students within the middle class. And anyone who was suspected of Marxist ideology could become a target. And they were called dirty wars because of the brutality and the repression that was carried out. So people would be abducted by non-uniformed police. They would be subjected to systematic interrogation and torture. And thousands of people disappeared. The police would bust into people's private homes and abduct, somebody who was accused of something, who was sympathized with leftists. And a lot of torture, as I mentioned. There was even some cases in Argentina where the military government, would fly people out across the Atlantic Ocean in helicopters and just drop them there. So there was thousands of people who were disappeared during these dirty wars. Something between 10 and 20,000 people disappeared. And all this was done kind of secretly. So it was very hard to keep records of all this. So historians are still learning a lot about all the people who disappeared during these dirty wars. And in the case of Brazil, I mentioned in the previous lecture how the Mann Doctrine had been formulated in March of 1964. And that gave the green light to the Brazilian military to seize power just a month later in April. And the Brazilian military comes to power. And what had happened is they overthrew a democratically elected government, João Goulart, who had been the president. And the political leadership of Brazil and in other countries, they got caught between the United States and the Cuban Revolution. Because on the one hand, peasants and workers were very inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and they were now calling for their own reforms in their country. So in Brazil, you had peasant unions and also labor unions who were mobilizing and calling for land reform. And this put political leaders in a very difficult situation because they didn't want to denounce the Cuban Revolution because that would upset many of their own people, but at the same time they didn't want to go against the United States in the war on communism. And the Brazilian Brazilian military seized power in April '64, and it would hold on to power for 21 years. And nobody expected for the military dictatorship to last that long. Everybody thought it would just be a brief stint, maybe just a few years. And at first, actually, the Brazilian dictatorship was not that brutal and authoritarian. However, by the late 1960s, it had definitely become much more authoritarian, and thousands of people were disappeared. And actually, a lot of Brazilian politicians in the last decade or two, Lula, who became president, for example, in the 2000s, they were resistant leaders. They led some of the resistance to the military regimes when they were young people in their 20s and when they were students. And also in Uruguay, the military dictatorship lasted 12 years. And Argentina as well experienced a long military dictatorship. First from 66 to 73, then they would try to restore power back to civilians, but the military again stepped in and seized power in 1976 until 1983. In the case of Argentina, there wasn't so much a rural guerrilla insurgency as there was an urban guerrilla movement. And a lot of these urban guerrillas, including in Uruguay and Brazil and in Argentina, they would carry out sabotage and bombings in the cities. And they would create disorder and chaos. And they would kidnap foreign businessmen. And they would rob banks. And just led a lot of violence, kind of resembled a civil war in these countries. And that was the way the military justified its seizure of power and holding on to it for so long, was in the name of putting down this resistance and and putting down communism, of course. Chile's dictatorship lasted from 1973 to 1990, but I'm going to spend a whole lecture discussing it here in a few minutes in the next lecture. Now, most countries experienced military dictatorships during the Cold War, and we'll look specifically at the Guatemalan national security state next week. We'll read about it in depth. But a few countries did not experience military dictatorships, and they included Mexico, Costa Rica, and Colombia. Now, I know Colombia underwent a little bit of military rule in the 1950s, but in Colombia it was mostly the National Front that ruled the government, which we'll talk about this week in the online discussion. And so I just want to spend a minute or two here discussing, why do these countries not fall to military dictatorships while the rest of the region did? And in the case of Mexico, Mexico was unique because it had already undergone a great social revolution that I discussed a few weeks ago on nationalism. And that was the 1910 Mexican Revolution. And I mentioned some of the reforms that had been carried out afterwards, but specifically there had been a great land reform that was carried out in Mexico in the 1920s and the 1930s, where hundreds of thousands of peasant families received titles to lands. And that had the long-term effect of decreasing tensions in society and in the countryside specifically. And in Mexico, instead of a military dictatorship, there was a party dictatorship that ruled the country from 1929 till 2000. So over 70 years, this party, and I put the logo here on the slide, the PRI, as it was called, the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. It ruled Mexico for all these decades during the Cold War. And the PRI, while it certainly was not democratic and had its authoritarian side, it did give peasants and workers a seat at the table, and it was supported by the middle class and by elites. And it was kind of like this giant coalition that ruled Mexico for all these years. And the PRI dominated the presidency for 70 years, Congress, the governorships, all the way down to even small towns where the mayors were all members of the PRI. And the PRI was more inclusive as a political regime than, say, other Latin American countries were at this time. And that was kind of a result of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, which had brought a lot of social reforms to the country. And for a long time, it was believed that Mexico did not have its own dirty war. But in fact, there was a little bit of a dirty war in Mexico, particularly in the 1970s, because there were some small guerrilla insurgencies in the south in states such as Guerrero, which took up arms against the PRI dictatorship, and the PRI party dictatorship, I should say. And the PRI used some dirty tactics to put down those small insurgencies. And that's something historians are actually starting to research and publish on about right now, is Mexico's dirty war, which, again, many people had believed that Mexico had not experienced this, and Mexico did not experience a dirty war, at least to the extent that other countries in, say, Guatemala and South America had done so. And then there's the case of Costa Rica. And Costa Rica's got a unique history when you compare it to its neighbors in Central America. And like Mexico, Costa Rica had undergone some social reforms in the 1940s. They had nationalized the bank system. There was a property tax that was implemented. The presidency was limited to just one term. Women were given the right to vote in Costa Rica. And Costa Rica also had a high literacy rate and a good public education system. And it had a pretty good social welfare system in general. And some of the main reasons that Costa Rica did not undergo a military dictatorship was there was less racial stratification in Costa Rica. Costa Rica doesn't have a large indigenous population like, say, Guatemala does. So there was less racism because there was just less stratification in that respect within Costa Rica, and also there was less land and economic inequalities in Costa Rica. So if you remember our lectures on coffee, I talked about how it was small family farms that dominated coffee production in Costa Rica. It wasn't like the giant haciendas in El Salvador and Guatemala that ruled coffee production. And there was a lot more inequality as a result of that in Guatemala compared to, say, Costa Rica. And also the army was abolished in Costa Rica in 1948. That was part of some of those social reforms that the country experienced in the 1940s. So less racial stratification, less economic inequality, and the fact that there was not an army in Costa Rica prevented, of course, a military dictatorship.